Prologue. 18 years before Zelda arrived in the distant past of Hyrule, Koume tipped the point of her spear toward the foe in front of her, directly into his line of sight. The desert sun glinted off the metal, absently reminding her that she'd need to buff its worn surface in the morning. She smirked as the Hylian man cowered, his hands shaking and his breaths coming fast and rough. She admired his strong features at the same time, and had she not been commissioned to kill him, she might have secreted him into Gerudo Town tonight. But alas, his fate was sealed the moment he decided to take the bounty hunt mission from the Hyrulean army, a growing concern for her people. The army itself had only just formed a few years ago, the first of many progressive moves the Hylians and certain other races in the land had made. They claimed to make a new world, coining the name Hyrule, and making moves toward forming a monarchy set on ruling everything and everyone. They hadn't yet been successful with the latter, and the Gerudo were intent upon ensuring they wouldn't be. They could not be ruled. They would not be ruled. Please don't do this. The Hylian's cheeks now streaked with tears, and Koume was no longer attracted. Weakness, especially in a man, was nothing but cowardice. If he wasn't strong, he wasn't anything. And Koume was strong. Koume understood how their world operated, a trait the Hylians seemed to lack. Hyrule be damned. You have 3 seconds to tell me who you were assigned to kill, or this spear goes directly through that eye. She aimed the spear tip at his right eye, as close as she could without touching it. Fear could root out weakness and make any man do what was necessary. She would have to pry it out of this one. Please. 3. I'm begging you. 2. She pressed the spear to his eyelid. It was the child, he rasped. The Hylian squeezed his eyes shut and sobbed harder. Koume lowered the spear tip slightly, only out of curiosity. There were many children in Gerudo Town, little girls running about, learning how to be strong. But there was also another child, barely a month old, one born of legend, of royalty and importance, the only male Gerudo in existence. He hadn't yet been given a name. The elders were debating whether to name him in accordance with what their historical volumes decreed, or to defy tradition and name him something else. Koume was of the mind that defying tradition was defying the very gods themselves, but she was no elder and therefore held no sway. But if this Hylian was referring to this male child... What were you told exactly? She asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. She needed him to feel less fear, it seemed, for him to be more forthcoming. He hesitated, but kept his eye on the spear tip, understanding what would happen if he didn't speak. To find the male child, and to dispense with him in any way possible. And that he is the key to unlocking Gerudo's subservience. He looked as though he might be sick. So, the Hyrulean army had a plan to cut the legs out from beneath the Gerudo. And perhaps they were right. In truth, if the child were to be taken out of the equation, the Gerudo would boast less strength. Koume didn't claim to know much about military politics, but she did know one thing. Her people's history proved that every 100 years they would birth a king. And prophecy foretold that king would be powerful. powerful enough to overthrow any usurper. There had never been an opportunity in the past, as far as she was aware, for that king to be challenged. But with the climate now... She gazed down at the Hylian, softening her eyes and smiling. She lowered her spear and knelt down to his level on the sand. "Thank you," she said to him, sincere in her gratitude. After all, he just gave her everything she needed to rise a little further in the ranks. Information like this was like a rare diamond. She raised her hand to his face and wiped his tears away gently, lovingly, as a mother would. She wanted him to feel safe now. His breathing slowed, and his sobs abated. And her spear was through his temple in half a second. It was the least she could do, to kill him quickly. The most thanks she could give. Koume buried the unnamed Hylian in the sand and started home. A fire burning in her eyes, and a plan churning in her mind. Chapter 1. A Boy. It was as though the very desert sands hated him. "Green man, green man." The girls laughed from their bellies. He stood in the center of the circle as they danced, as they sing-songed their insults at him like silver knives. And he could only stand still, staring at the ground, allowing himself to sink further and further into his dejection and anger. He glanced down at his hands, a dark grayish green, just as they sang, and cursed them. Why did he have to look so different? Not only was he the only male Gerudo, he was the only Gerudo at all with this outlandish look. Not even Zora looked like this. Their skin was a beautiful array of color, translucent and glistening. They were otherworldly. He was just ugly. Of course, he had only seen Zora from afar, and only on one of the few trips he had taken outside of Gerudo Town with his mothers. He remembered that day like the layout of the Gerudo Underground. Koume hadn't wanted Ganondorf to come with them, but Kotake had insisted, citing that he needed to see the world over which he would one day rule. They had left Gerudo Town in search of ore, a main source of income for Kotake's small gem emporium in the city. Normally she would go alone, but this time Ganondorf would get to see what Hyrule was like outside of sand, sun, and blistering heat. He closed his eyes now, trying to feel the cool air on his face again, hear the rush of waterfalls near Zora's domain, where the ore was plentiful. He could almost taste the rain that persistently fell there, and the shrill voices of the taunting girls began to fade. Almost. "Get away, he's only a boy, get away!" A familiar, softer voice declared, dissolving his reverie and forcing him back into his ugly green body. Though the owner of that voice was his one true friend, he silently cursed it too. He may never again see the world beyond the desert, so daydreaming about it was really the only freedom he could feel. He'd have to wait until bed tonight to slip back into the daydream and hope that his actual dreams were drenched in the same beauty that was seemingly fading away from memory a little more each day. "Gan, are you okay?" Jarusa had successfully shooed away the other girls and was now inches from him, holding out her hand to grasp his shoulder. He scooted backward, avoiding her touch. "I'm fine," he replied, avoiding her eyes too. Jerusa sighed, and he knew it to be her sign of frustration, with him in particular. They'd been close since birth, as they were both born on the same day under the same sun. Ganondorf's true mother was a friend to Jerusa's, so they were raised together. They played together, learned together, and even trained together. 10 years of together, and she still tried to placate him with mercy. He had grown up in a unique circumstance, being the only male of his people. No one quite knew how to speak to him or treat him. Even the elders had trouble communicating with him. His many differences distanced him from everyone else, and when his true mother died fighting against the Hyrulean army, when he was just 2 years of age, the sisters Koumei and Kotake took him in and began to raise him differently. They were the only two Gerudo who seemed to understand, to really see inside him, like he was more than just the future king who might rescue the entire Gerudo race from the usurper King Roru. Might, yes, because Ganondorf did not see himself as a king, a leader, a ruler of any kind. "Why do you let them bully you?" Jerusa asked, her hands now on her hips and her head cocked to one side. "You're the future king, Gan, the king, and you let them trample on you like a Molduga?" He simply stared meekly at the ground. Before he could react, Jerusa grabbed him by the shoulder and shook him. "You deserve better than this. Why don't you believe that?" He finally raised his eyes to meet hers and saw humor in their golden red depths. He couldn't help but smile a little. "I believe that you need a bath," he deflected, and waved his hand in front of his pointed nose, grimacing. She scoffed and pushed him, sending him flying to the ground, but not before he was able to sweep her feet out from under her. They both lay sprawled on the sands in fits of laughter. "You rat!" she squeaked. "How long has it been anyway? A week?" "Unfortunately, I'm not a royal prince who can take a bath any old second he wishes. Besides, baths are for Zora. I don't need water to live." "Everyone needs water to live," Ganondorf retorted, throwing a fist of sand at her. "Too bad you can't wash the green off you." Jerusa raised her eyebrows in challenge. "You are lucky you're a friend, or I'd..." A different voice sounded. "You'd be a gentlemanly prince and help the little lady off the ground? Now wouldn't you?" Ganondorf recognized Koumei's voice and his demeanor shifted. He stood and did as he was told, reaching for Jerusa's hand, who gratefully, if sheepishly, accepted it. They stood in front of Koumei, a bit awkwardly, awaiting her next words. She gazed at them with a small smirk playing on her lips. Koumei could boast a whirlwind of rage, and other times, her kindness prevailed, but it was never clear which emotion one would get from her until she unleashed it. Ganondorf stood up straighter. "You two will never learn, will you?" Koumei said, a chuckle escaping her throat. The children relaxed. No rage today. "Go on now, Jerusa. Tell your mother you need a bath. Even warriors need to take care of themselves." Jerusa nodded in reply and shot Ganondorf a quick, amused look before running off. Koumei regarded him for a moment. "I heard those girls were taunting you again," she said, an eyebrow raised. He wanted to look to the ground, but forced his eyes to keep their level. Koumei did not like anyone showing signs of weakness, especially Ganondorf. As an elder, she held fast to the rules. She'd even ensured he was named according to the prophecy, solidifying his fate. Or so she claimed. "One of these days you will have to fight one of them. When they grow older, they'll grow bolder. Someone will attempt to dominate you. That is the way of our kind, after all. And you will have to kill them." His brows drew together. She had mentioned this scenario before, and he'd never quite believed her. Gerudo fought each other all the time, of course. She was right about that. But he was to be king. Shouldn't that mean no one should challenge him, especially his own people? But Koumei never said anything she didn't mean or truly believe. "That's why I'm training, right?" he said, hoping it was the reply she wanted from him. He didn't want to admit that he'd kill anyone. He didn't know if he could. It was an ultimate act that no one should take lightly. Kotake taught him that, but Koumei had a bit more liberal view of taking a life. She'd done it many times. "Indeed, your training is important, not only for your physical, but your political self. You will be our ruler and protector. You must be able to do both with no hesitation." The intensity of her voice scared him a little, but he'd never let it show. He breathed deliberately and slowly, steadying himself so that he didn't shake. Without another word, Koumei strode away, and he was able to relax his tightened shoulders. He sighed, the weight of his birthright heavy and burdensome. He looked down at his hands again, the green growing darker as the sun began to set. How he was to be king, he did not know. The king's hands should never tremble this much. Chapter 2: A Conquest. Little is known of the Zonai other than that they came from the heavens in order to take control of our land. And now, it seems the usurper king is seeking a queen. What does this mean for us? Sharida, Ganondorf's tutor and mentor for the last year or so, had been droning on for a good hour now. Ganondorf couldn't have cared less about the usurper king's current female conquests, but it was all part of his training, a delightful daily session of droning. What did it matter if the king obtained a queen? He'd be just as powerful, just as lethal, possessing his power of light, with or without a woman by his side. No one knew where his power came from, if it was simply innate in him, or if he had sought it out. King Rauru was a mystery to many, and the Gerudo had been taking the time to study him and figure out his weaknesses, all so that Ganondorf could destroy him when he was finally old enough and able. The thought of it churned his stomach. "Ganondorf, what can the queen do to break us? How is she powerful just by being a queen?" He thought hard, trying his best to discern what kind of power a queen possessed. Magical power? Control of some kind? As a female, she already possessed power. That much he knew just from living with women his entire life. Gerudo women in particular were stronger than most Hylian men. But what was it in particular she possessed that could threaten them? I'm not sure, he stammered, disappointed in himself. Think about it. She would be a pillar, a groundbreaker. Why? Sharida gazed down at him as he perched on a stool in the middle of the Gerudo underground classroom. Normally, the women would take courses here on how to interact with Hylian men, their very own conquests. After all, if they didn't commit to relationships outside of their own people, they would have dwindled to nothing over very little time. That was another responsibility of the Gerudo king, however, fathering as many children as possible when he came of age. Koumei said he wouldn't even have to raise them. Father children, his responsibility as king. His eyes widened as he realized the answer to Sharida's question was quite simple. She'll be able to make an heir to continue their family line and strengthen their claim to the throne. Sharita smiled, a certain pride shining out. Indeed, she said. It's the most powerful ability she possesses, more powerful than any magic. The stronger the family line, the more dangerous she is to those who wish to be free of their occupation. Whoever the usurper chooses will have the great honor of mothering the future king or queen of Hyrule, our future enemy. Ganondorf knew how that honor could make or break a nation, and though he didn't have to take a queen for himself, he would still be furthering their own people's long history, ensuring their survival. He'd have to do as much as he could until his own death, until another king could be born. He felt the pressure like a cork stopping a bottle. But he also felt a certain amount of vanity. He was the only one who had the power that King Raru's queen would have, which meant he was the only one who could challenge her rule. In fact, one day he may have to make the very serious decision to eliminate her. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, there was something enticing about it. Morbid and immoral, yes, but enticing. He truly did hold the power, and he wondered how much that power might change him. Chapter 3: Adira. The weekly trips to the Kara Kara Bazaar were a highlight of Ganondorf's quite depressing existence. Kotake would take him there, often with Jarusa in tow, and they'd walk the perimeter lined with merchants selling their wares. Most of them were Gerudo, but every now and then a daring Hylian would set up shop, wishing for new clientele, and also hoping to keep their head. The Gerudo were protective of the bazaar, even though it was a public space existing off of Gerudo Town grounds. Many races shopped there, as the customers were rarely challenged. They were there to spend their rupees after all, and the Gerudo couldn't pass that up. Not now. Today, Ganondorf and Jarusa snickered at one such Hylian woman who was trying to buy a handful of energetic rhino beetles, but was having an issue keeping them from flying off. The bugs weaponized sharp tusks that could slice you easily if you weren't careful. Kotake kept an eye on the children from a few feet away while they tried to hide their giggles. Jarusa eventually gave up on watching the woman fail miserably and ran over to assist her, pulling a bug net out of her pack and gifting it to her. The woman smiled gratefully and shook Jarusa's hand, offering her a blue rupee in return. "What are you looking at me like that for?" Jarusa asked Ganondorf as she trotted back over to him. "No reason," he said. "It's just, are we really supposed to be helping Hylians?" "It was a transaction. Besides, does it really matter who anyone supports here?" Perhaps she was right. The bazaar was a melting pot of races, and the customer-merchant relationship was kept rather sacred. Still, it made Ganondorf uncomfortable to watch Jarusa get so close to a Hylian without a weapon. Though Hylians had become an essential resource for Gerudo lineage, it still bothered him to be around them. He didn't remember it, but Koume had made it abundantly clear that Ganondorf's life was threatened by Hylians countless times when he was younger. She had murdered several in retaliation, often describing the gory details to him. A certain amount of fear had been instilled in him, coloring his opinion of the most common race in Hyrule. He didn't know who he could trust, and Hylians were very low on that list. But he didn't feel like arguing today. "You're right. Want to go look at the fish?" They bought 5 stamina kvass and some rock salt to cook that night. Jerusa would come over for dinner most nights, claiming she hated dinner with her own family, which consisted of 10 rowdy siblings. Ganondorf didn't blame her. Though he often felt lonely, he wasn't sure how many people living under one roof he could stand. "Well, look who it is. The future king." The voice, dripping with a sarcasm that rivaled many, stopped them in their tracks just as they were about to head back. Kotake protectively placed her hand on Jerusa's and Ganondorf's shoulders as they turned to see Adira, a Gerudo girl of 14, eyeing them with a gleeful snobbery. She often led the bullying of him and had coined the term Green Man long ago. Her fiery red eyes squinted in the sunlight, and she carried a scythe on her hip where her hand rested. Ganondorf's hate for Adira had grown exponentially over the last year. She was a seething reminder of the fact that not every Gerudo supported his claim. In fact, several Gerudo probably wished him dead. Many expressed that they preferred the hierarchy of the last 100 years, elders rather than a king presiding over the city. They claimed they didn't need a king, that Ganondorf was simply a mutation of chance, and that he should not be given power. Supporters of this faction remained mostly quiet, but Adira had always been a loud proclaimer of the opinion. Even at a young age, she made her thoughts known to him and anyone else who would listen. Speaking against it was one thing, actions against it were another, so she got away with it. "Adira, it's getting late. Perhaps you should join us on our walk home," Kotake said, obviously trying to be amiable but clearly asserting dominance. "I'm not finished here quite yet, but thank you for the offer, Mother of Kings." Adira flashed a sly smile, her eyes shining with hatred. Ganondorf closed his own eyes for a moment, steadying himself. Any time he encountered Adira, he felt an incredible tension inside his chest, as though something was clawing to get out, something that wanted to do terrible things to those who wronged him. When he opened them, he saw Jerusa had stepped closer to Adira. "Why don't you slither back to your home, you wretched traitor?" she said, and spat at Adira's feet. "Jerusa!" Kotake hissed, grabbing her and pulling her backward. "Let's go." But Jerusa wrenched away from her grasp. Adira cackled, throwing her head back and allowing her red mane of hair to funnel down her shoulders. "Oh, you amuse me, Jerusa. 10 years old and you have so much fire in you. Why do you waste it on this trash you call a king?" "The only trash here is—" "And now you bore me. I have things to do here, so run along, children. See you later, Green Man." She sashayed away, oozing overconfidence, and it made Ganondorf sick. The tension in his chest grew for a few seconds, but then abated as Adira ambled farther from them. He felt himself deflating as he realized he hadn't said one word to her in defense. Jerusa was the only one who ever defended him outright like that. Even Koume kept her comments to herself most of the time, and Kotake was one to avoid confrontation. Jerusa scoffed. "That coward! I'd like to see her try and fight either of us. We'd demolish her." He didn't know if that was true, but he'd like to think so, considering the rage inside him that seemed to grow each time he came across the betrayer. She would get what was coming to her. He'd like to believe that too, anyway. "Let's go home, children," Kotake said, pulling them both closer to her and glancing around nervously. Even now, after 10 years, there was still risk when bringing Ganondorf outside of the city walls. And intended or not, the vibe he got from Adira today was off, even more so than usual. Normally, she would have stuck around to call him more names or poke more fun, but this time she barely even spoke to him. He should feel grateful, but instead, he felt uneasy. He was quiet on the walk home, while Jerusa continued to berate Adira from afar. Kotake squeezed his shoulder every now and then, letting him know she was there with him, and everything would be okay. But would it? The older he grew, the more he began to see the true souls of the people surrounding him, and what these people were capable of was a terrifying prospect, especially considering what it meant for his own already dark future. Chapter 4: A Power. He just could not concentrate today. To every question Sharita posed him, he gave a basic answer. He knew he wasn't trying, but his mind refused to cooperate. It would only focus on the anxiety creeping within his chest and stomach. He bounced his knee the entire lesson, and Sharita finally gave up and dismissed him with a shake of her head. He took the steps up from the underground and into the hot sun below the throne room, where one day he would spend his waking moments. Koume had sent him a note written in her infamous red ink, ordering him to go straight home after his lesson. But it didn't feel right. None of this felt right. How Jerusa had to always stand up for him, how Koume constantly reminded him of his responsibility. How Kotake took a passive approach to his everyday upbringing, the bullying, the fear, the hard looks from certain unconfirmed Gerudo traitors. It was exhausting, and he couldn't stand it for one more second. He felt like his chest was going to explode. Ganondorf ducked into a shadowy corner and waited for a guard to pass before taking a deep breath and bolting toward the southern wall of Gerudo Town. He knew the ins and outs of the square-shaped city, knew every passage and every entrance, and every exit, even the secret ones. Arriving at the wall, he jumped high into the air to grasp the top and pulled himself up and over it. He splashed through the flowing water cradled in the recesses of the walls and jumped down at the farthest edge, landing in the sand. Just outside of the least protected part of his city. No one was around, so he put up his hood to protect his face from the harsh sun and walked. Perhaps he should be fearful of monsters, but he wasn't. He'd done this before. Moldugas were an issue in some parts of the desert, but not where he'd be trekking. Besides, he'd feel the vibrations of their bodies slamming to the ground before he even came close to one. The many Lizalfos haunting the sands also posed a problem, and they could camouflage themselves effectively. But he brought his scimitar with him. He'd already successfully killed monsters, just not people. As he walked, the sun rose higher into the sky, sending heat waves rippling across the sands and sweat dripping down his back. It was uncomfortable, but at the same time it calmed his anxiety and the imploding feeling inside him. That feeling had been rising to new heights in the last few weeks since meeting Adira at the bazaar, and it was changing. He had been training his body harder in that time, sparring with Jerusa, trying to force the feelings out of him, with no success. He hadn't told anyone about it, mostly because he didn't know what it was, or if it was anything at all. It was probably just nerves, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. Something inside him was growing, something dark. The more he walked, the less he felt it, and he took that as a win. just for today. Pausing to take a sip of water from his canteen, he abruptly froze in place. Footsteps sounded from somewhere else. Had he been followed? It could be anyone, but he carefully put away his canteen and unsheathed his scimitar, just in case. The footsteps sounded slower than his own, which told him the person was either deliberately slowing their pace or they hadn't donned sand shoes. If it was the latter, it meant a stranger. Ganondorf focused his hearing on the steps, noting that they were coming from his left side. He took a fighting stance and awaited the intruder's arrival, refusing to look their way. He would use his other senses, as he had been trained to do, in order to appear ignorant. It was his best chance, especially if they were larger than he. They'd see him looking in the wrong direction and think they had the drop on him, when truly he would strike before they could blink. The steps came closer and slowed. Ganondorf focused on his periphery, trying to spot any visual clues that would tell him who or what he was dealing with. They came into view, and he could just see dark brown pants and a light blue tunic, the clothing of a Hylian for certain. He was just about to whirl into a strike when the Hylian spoke. "Excuse me, do you have any elixirs?" A man's voice, pleading. Ganondorf relaxed his stance, only slightly, to peer to the man. He appeared normal enough. Dark brown hair, a button nose, small eyes, a beard, all traits of many Hylians he had seen over the years. He looked to be in his 50s. The man was sweating as well and swaying on his feet. He was most certainly afflicted by the desert heat, a surefire way to fall ill and die quickly. The man reached out to him. "I hate to ask this of you, but I have rupees. Please." He fell to his knees. Jerusa's kind eyes came to mind. Her gift to the Hylian woman at the bazaar, her graceful empathy. Perhaps not every Hylian was dangerous. Perhaps he was being prejudiced, paranoid. Without thinking too hard about it, Ganondorf sheathed his scimitar and rushed to the Hylian, holding him up by his arms. "Try to stay awake," he told him. "Breathe. I have just the thing." He rustled through his pack to find a small bottle of heat-resistant elixir. Kotake made them quite often. Even the Gerudo needed protection from the heat. It wouldn't last long, but perhaps long enough for the man to escape the desert unscathed. As he raised the bottle and popped its top, the man greedily gulped it down. "Slowly," Ganondorf urged. The Hylian sighed with relief as the medicine took effect, and stood. Ganondorf still held his arms, just in case. "Thank you. Truly," he smiled. Ganondorf smiled back, feeling a certain sense of satisfaction. Was this what Jerusa felt each time she was kind to someone? It wasn't as though Ganondorf couldn't be kind. He just felt a blockade, like something internal wouldn't allow him to truly care enough about anything or anyone. But for a moment, he thought he felt something good about helping this Hylian man. And in one swift moment, those thoughts were dashed. The Hylian twisted Ganondorf's arms around so unexpectedly, he had no time to react. His back was now pinned against the man's front, and a traveler's sword was to his throat. "So," the Hylian whispered into Ganondorf's ear, "you're the male Gerudo everyone is talking about." Ganondorf struggled, but the man had him firmly in his grip. He was much stronger than a 10-year-old boy, even one who had been trained. "Let me go, or I promise the Gerudo will have your head," he said as calmly as he could, but could not hide the slight tremor in his voice. "Oh, the Gerudo who have vowed to protect you up until and beyond your coronation? Who do you think sent me to kill you?" Ganondorf stilled. Adira's snarling face flashed in his mind, and he knew it had to be her. The Hylian placed more pressure against his throat. I think I'll be keeping my head, but you, he chuckled. I'll need proof of my kill, and your head will do just fine. Fear coursed through him. Unadulterated, uncontrollable fear. He'd never felt anything like it, and thought he might pass out from the sheer shock. But instead, he felt a familiar tug in his chest, a pull from inside him. A power. He hadn't thought of it as power before, but in this moment, that's what it was. It's what it always had been. He just hadn't recognized it. And now, in this most dire moment, he would use it. He allowed it to explode from his chest, his hands, his feet, every part of him. The force blew the Hylian back, and Ganondorf heard him scream as though he were being stabbed. The man's blade went flying, and Ganondorf turned, the power pulsating around him, an angry red color rivaling the deepest and darkest blood. It seemed to be communicating with him somehow. It wanted him to act. He looked down at his hands and watched as it formed into spheres of red energy in his palms. It writhed like snakes, swirling and searching for something to consume. He should have been concerned at this reckless magic, this explosion of strength within him, but he only felt a pure desire for destruction. He raised his eyes to see the Hylian cowering before him 10 feet away. The man couldn't seem to get up, struggling to rise and attempting to flee with little success. This was the moment Koumei was talking about. One day, he would have to kill. He shouldn't. He should just bring the man back to Gerudo Town and turn him over, let him be interrogated, figure out exactly how Adira had done this. But he didn't want any of that. He wanted to use his power. So he did. He raised both hands and allowed the power to freely flow outward. The red tendrils burst forth, devouring the Hylian, who screamed again, a strangled cry for help that went unanswered. Ganondorf watched, wide-eyed as the man was lifted into the air by the magic as it completely consumed him, disintegrating his body into absolutely nothing. The very sky turned red. As soon as it was over, the energy dissipated, slowly fading away, the sky above him returning to its vast and cloudless blue. But the power wasn't gone. Ganondorf still felt it within him, but now it didn't feel like an anxious vibration. Now it felt like a friend. Now it felt like him. Chapter 5. 8 Years. The sandstorm had shrouded the desert and the city for weeks, halting hunting and blocking trading routes. Though he wasn't yet king, his coronation 2 weeks away, Ganondorf felt the need to step into the leadership role anyway, and find a solution. The elders had all but dissipated as his time drew near. They shadowed the background, but allowed him the leeway to make certain decisions for the city. He was to be 18, an adult in the Gerudo's eyes, and a man in his mother's. Mainly Koumei, who still harped on him every single day to be strong. He had done many brave things that seemed to boast strength for certain, but he did not truly feel the strength Koume claimed he should. Even after what happened 8 years ago, when he killed a man for the first time. Avoiding similar situations since then had been difficult. Those red, angry tendrils of power still resided within him, testing him each day, bubbling and churning with his emotions. Even now, he hadn't fully gained control over it. Sometimes rage would bring it out, and he could not stop it. Other times, angst or even sadness would allow it to rear its malicious head. Malicious was a descriptor Ganondorf gave it that seemed appropriate. Though it belonged to him and felt at home within him, it still seemed to have a mind of its own, and all it wanted was death. The sand seals refused to go too far, Jiri explained to him now, one of the guards of the East Gate. Even the trained ones. They can't see and they know what's out there. Ganondorf sat, listening to his advisors in a chair adjacent to the actual throne, upon which he would not sit until his birthday. But the people, most of them anyway, regarded him highly, and insisted he at least reside in the throne room until that day. Many of the young girls who had mocked him throughout his childhood now took stances of loyalty, the irony of which was not lost on him. So far, none had gone as far as to outwardly challenge his tentative rule. "And the hunters?" he asked Aura, the West Gate guard. "No luck, my prince. Even the birds seem to have moved on, for now. Only foraging has brought us any sustenance, but only within close proximity to the city, and soon we will have depleted all of those resources." Ganondorf sighed out his frustration, sensing a boiling in his chest that he fought to bring down to a simmer. It seemed hopeless. He looked out towards the city center, just outside the throne room, where his people usually milled about. Children who normally could be heard laughing and playing went unseen. The city merchants stood outside their shops, aimlessly watching for customers who weren't patronizing. And the shroud covered the sky in a sepia haze that refused to abate. There was only one choice, and he would have to make it. The closer his coronation came, the more he began to realize that all of this, his life, his destiny, was truly fated. Each step he took brought him closer to it. There was no stopping it, no matter how hard he'd tried. Once he made that fateful decision 8 years ago, the hill took a sharp slope downward. So now, he simply allowed it to take him where it would. He gazed at the group in front of him as they waited expectantly for his decision. There flickered a small twinge of anxiety within him at the thought of their reaction. But it didn't matter. Did anything or anyone truly matter, other than him? "We will send out an expedition of only the strongest warriors in the city," he finally said. "Those who can stand the harsh environment, we will make the trek to Kakariko village and ask for assistance." The silence in the room was like an intense pressure on his ears. His mothers stood in a corner to his right, and he could feel their disapproval emanating from them like burning heat. "My prince, the village, the Sheikah reside there. They are under King Raru's rule. They serve him," Aura said, her confusion evident. He gazed at her with a stone face. "You do not need to tell me things I already know." She opened her mouth to reply, but thought better of it and bowed her head instead. "The Sheikah are a proud people," he said to everyone in the room, raising his voice to a level that exuded authority. "Yes, they serve King Raru. but they also serve peace, for Hyrule's sake. They have technology that far surpasses anything we possess, and while they may not give that up, they also would not be willing to watch an entire race die away in a world they so dearly love. And if they decide not to help us, he waited a beat, we will simply take what we need. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Ganondorf glanced at Koume and saw her eyes were lit with a fire he knew to mean she approved. But she would not approve of his next order. I will lead this expedition, and I will choose who accompanies me. Let me go with you, Jerusa begged him, following him about the room as he packed for the expedition that would leave in 2 hours' time. He slid 3 scimitars into their scabbards on either side of his waist and affixed a large club on his back, his choice weapon of late. His decision to lead the group into Kakariko was accepted hesitantly, though Koume did her best to convince him to stay, citing that his coronation was near. But he argued that their people's survival through this ordeal was far more important than having a symbolic crown placed on his head. She'd quietly conceded, and as news spread of his order, volunteers rushed the throne room, including Jerusa. But he had denied her. The unit is full, he replied, avoiding her wide and desperate eyes. Overpacked, in fact. We have more than we need. Don't shut me out, she said, grasping his arm and stilling him. He refused to look at her. I can help. You know I can. But you're telling me no because you don't want me near you, do you? Ganondorf pulled away and continued packing. You're a coward, she said, her voice dripping with a disdain that gutted him. Finally, he met her gaze. There were tears in her eyes, but she was not allowing them to fall. She had grown into an elegant warrior over the years, one full of pride and honor. He had admired those traits for so long. Sometimes he forgot that she could also feel emotion. I can't risk you, he said in reply, hoping against hope that she would drop this. But no such luck existed. Yes, you can, and you should. I'm the best warrior you have, and as king you— I am not yet king, he said, feeling his voice rise in volume, unbidden emotion kindling within. Jerusa was the only person alive with whom he could be vulnerable now. He tried not to allow himself the weakness of giving in to that fact, but every so often it spilled over. She strode up to him, unfazed by his outburst, and grasped both of his arms. You are the only rightful leadership we have. Don't let what happened between us cloud your judgment. He didn't want to think of it. The incident clouded more than his judgment. It clouded everything. It made his entire life so complicated that he could barely see through it, as though the sandstorm were shrouding his very soul. It had been a month now, but he remembered it clearly. The way her eyes shone in the moonlight, how she smiled at him, cupped his cheek in her hand. No, his life was too full of uncertainty to become wrapped up in whatever it was that existed between them. I can't risk you, he said again. You're right. You're my best warrior, which is why you must stay. Protect the city while it's vulnerable. Gan, This is my final word. His anger boiled over for a few tense seconds, and the red tendrils leached out from his hands. Reaching for Jerusa as though she were prey to be hunted, she gasped and backed away, knowing what it was and what it meant. He shook with concentration and pulled the energy back into himself, shutting his eyes against its struggle for the freedom to destroy. The older he became, the stronger it grew, and the more dangerous for everyone around him, even Jerusa, for whom he cared more than most. She stood still, her eyes unable to meet his. Jerusa, please go. Protect this city as I ask, he said in a low, controlled voice. He couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what had just occurred. She was silent at first, but then spoke with an icy bite he knew could be fatal to their friendship. Of course, my prince. She never called him that. Not in 18 years. Jerusa strode out of the room, and Ganondorf allowed himself only a small moment of despair before continuing to ready for the mission. Chapter 6: The Canyon. Even in Gerudo Canyon, the breeze felt cooler. Though the desert became almost like winter itself at night, the air was always so still and dry. As Ganondorf and his group of warriors traversed the vast land toward Kakariko, he was reminded of those beauteous landscapes he saw as a child, where the surroundings didn't fill him with angst. The wind. It is blowing, he said to Jiri, who accompanied him as a king's guard, blowing us toward a future we can sustain. He sighed as he gazed up towards the tall red-orange cliffsides surrounding them. Why don't they see it? Koume hadn't even said goodbye to him. Kotake gave him a bear hug, of course, and Jerusa, she was nowhere to be found when it came time to leave. Adira had stood by the entrance, sneering at him. Even now, even after every show of power he'd made, she still did not fear him. She still despised him. After the incident with the Hylian and the surfacing of Ganondorf's magical ability, he had gone home to his mother's and confessed what had occurred. Koume was beyond proud, and Kotake was uneasy. He told them what the Hylian had said, that the Gerudo had something to do with the attempt on his life, that it must be Adira, it had to be. Her hate for him made it more than obvious. Koume promised to initiate an investigation, citing that they needed proof before they could pass judgment on her. But what came of it created even more tension between Adira and the future king. My prince, they will see it. Once you bring assistance back to them, once they see the lengths you've gone to keep them safe, they'll see, Jiri replied, obviously desperate to appease him. Ganondorf muttered a non-committal response and stood to signal to the party that their break was over. They followed suit and marched behind him. They had to walk, considering they owned no horses, and sand seals could not breach the boundary between the desert and the canyon. It felt odd to walk on more solid ground, but it calmed him, made him feel stable and connected. Perhaps he truly was meant to rule this land. He felt such a kinship to it after all. The beauty of the landscapes, the very weather itself, the desert was not enough for him. It never would be. As they moved forward, Ganondorf spotted movement ahead. He lifted a fist and the party halted. A flash of red and blue could be seen, and a strange, high-pitched guttural sound echoed through the canyon. A war cry. The Gerudo around him altered their stances and pulled their weapons, preparing. Ganondorf had never before seen bokoblins, the snout-nosed, floppy-eared creatures that littered the land of Hyrule. But he had heard tell of their wildness, albeit their uncoordinated reputations. He thought he should feel nervous at least, but he felt nothing. The Red One charged him, heedless of the number of Gerudo that stood in front of it, and the imminent death it would experience. He stepped forward to fight, but Jiri held up a hand and moved in front of him. A surge of anger threatened to spill from him, but he calmed himself, knowing that his people simply wanted their prince safeguarded. He watched as his warriors formed a protective line around him and promptly cut the bokoblin down. It only took 2 hits and the creature collapsed into a heap, while the blue one charged in the same way. Ganondorf saw its eyes, reflecting the light and shining a mindless hatred. A fleeting thought passed through him that an army of these brutish beasts would pose more of a problem. Before he could imagine the resulting chaos of such a horror, the blue bokoblin was cut down as well. Its blood splattered across the hard-packed orange dirt. Jiri turned to him. "Are you all right, my prince?" "Fine," he said. "Let's move on." These distractions were good. It allowed him to think less of Jerusa and of his destiny. It only forced him to focus on the path ahead, and though it was full of enemies, large and small, he could see right through them. Chapter 7: The Lady. The next 2 days proved mostly uneventful. Though the company had been attacked more than once by small mobs of monsters, Ganondorf had only gotten the opportunity to fight twice, but reserved his magic, unwilling to waste it on the mewling, weak creatures. The weather warmed considerably as they traveled, and today was the most comfortable it had been. The sun high in the air, but not scalding, and the breeze light. It was no wonder that the Sheikah had chosen this land upon which to live. The greenery outstretched farther than he could see, plains of grass that seemed to cascade with waves like the ocean, and the sky clouded at times, rain falling softly. They had yet to encounter a thunderstorm, but there was still time. And today was the day. They finally approached the west entrance to Kakariko Village, a narrow valley between 2 large hills that was, surprisingly, unguarded. Hills surrounded the entire village, in fact, protecting it, godlike guardians topped with green, rising high into the sky. The company of Gerudo marveled at the differences between this place and their home. Gerudo Town and the surrounding desert were open, vast, and fairly flat. Kakariko couldn't be more of a contradiction. Ganondorf idolized it all. There was so much to be gained, made more evident the farther in they walked. The peace was intoxicating. Sheikah men and women ambling about their gardens, harvesting fruitful crops and softly speaking with one another. They acknowledged the company with pleasant nods, unquestioning. He passed wells full of clear water, armor shops and food stores, and a large house on stilts with a pointed roof that he could tell must house the leader of this alien place. He held up a hand and his company halted. He would approach the house alone, strategizing that a peaceful first attempt would be more wise than anything. These people didn't seem like fighters, but the Sheikah were a mysterious and intelligent race. For all he knew, they had many safeguards in place that he just couldn't see. As he approached the impressive structure, the only 2 guards visible stood watch just at the stairwell entrance and snapped to defensive stances as they spotted him. Ganondorf was an intimidating presence now. He had grown up, not just in mind, but in body. Kotake commonly joked that his muscles had grown muscles. These men recognized his strength, and they were not happy with his confident advance. So he stepped forward slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. The men did not move, but one of them spoke. "State your name and business." His eyes narrowed as he gave Ganondorf the once-over. Perhaps he had no knowledge of the future Gerudo King, or he was playing coy for an advantage. Either way, Ganondorf would play their game. "I am Ganondorf, future King of the Gerudo. I am here to seek an audience with your ruler, if they'll have me." He smiled, feigning friendliness. "The Gerudo?" The man glanced past Ganondorf's shoulder at his warriors and back at him. "You're a long way from home." "We are, and we have important matters to bring to your leader's attention." He wasn't going to take no. He would push until he could push no more, and further action must be taken. The guards exchanged glances, communicating something silently between them, and then stood at ease. "The Lady Impa is inside," one of them said. The same guard put out his hand, and Ganondorf understood that he was to give up his weapons. He hesitated, but then relented, knowing he could rely on his power if necessary. They parted, revealing a way up the stairwell, which Ganondorf promptly took, nodding his thanks. Neither of them looked particularly satisfied, but he supposed they had no choice but to let him pass. Lady Impa must have been someone of importance in this place, but he hadn't heard her name before. She was not named Queen, so the rumors of the Sheikah's allegiance with the monarchy were probably true. As he had told his people, it mattered not who the Sheikah supported. He would convince this Lady Impa to help them, whether it ended in peace or in violence. After all, no one could withstand his malicious power. He climbed the stairs and pushed open the double doors leading into the house, marveling at the structure. The entrance room boasted detailed paintings of both lands in Hyrule and recorded histories. In the center of the room sat a middle-aged woman, dressed in white, just as her fellow people. But she gave off a regal air, telling Ganondorf she must be Lady Impa. "Welcome, Prince Ganondorf," she said, kneeling with her hands clasped in front of her. She already knew him. An informed woman, then. "My lady," he replied, bowing his head slightly. "It seems I am already known to you. Do you know why I am here?" Lady Impa cocked her head to the side regarding him. "There is a terrible weather blight interfering with life in your city, yes?" He nodded, his brow furrowed. How did she know so much? "Do sit," she said, gesturing to a cushion on the floor opposite her. He took his seat, as requested. "You require assistance. This I can provide you." That was perhaps too easy. "My lady, that is generous of you. We've traveled a far distance to ask for help, and it is not normally my people's way. We're proud." She smiled serenely. "I understand being proud, and you should be. Your history is expansive, and you must prioritize your traditions. The same goes with my people." He nodded, a quiet relief coming over him. Violence would not be necessary. "I am glad you can empathize." "What is it you require, Prince Ganondorf? I can only provide so much, but I will try my best to accommodate." "We're running low on provisions, my lady. The hunters have stopped and the foraging is proving less fruitful. Our transportation is also frozen. We cannot move around the desert freely. Sand shrouds have accosted us in the past, and for this we have trained ourselves to push through and survive. But we've never been faced with one this fierce or extended. I can provide you everything you need, Lady Impa said without hesitation. That's wonderful to hear. Ganondorf almost allowed a genuine smile to show. His people truly would see that this was the best choice. They wouldn't second-guess him again, especially not when he was finally crowned. Yes, she replied. However, I must insist upon one condition. Ah, so there was a catch. And what might that be, my lady? The regal woman smiled again. I ask that you and your people lay down your arms and pledge fealty to King Rauru, the rightful King of Hyrule. Chapter 8: A Secret. The boiling inside him threatened to spill over, so close that he could feel his eyes heating. An overwhelming urge to wipe out this woman with his power came over him, but he tortuously kept it down. He was sure that something dark flashed in his eyes for a moment, yet unsure if it was obvious to her. But she showed no recognition or surprise. He simmered enough to allow himself to speak. This is an unacceptable ask, he said, quieting the rage inside. What happens to you must prioritize your traditions. The Gerudo will never be ruled by anyone other than their own rightful king. Lady Impa narrowed her eyes slightly. Have you met King Rauru, Prince Ganondorf? Ganondorf shook his head in disgust. It was the last thing he wanted. Once he met the king, he'd have to kill the king. The act would be inevitable, but the thought of it now proved overwhelming. I suggest you give it a try. King Rauru is one of the most empathetic beings I've met, and I've lived a long time. Our people have our own traditions, of which the king has graciously approved. If you were to speak with him, I'm sure he would come to a compromise as to the future leadership of your city. He only wants peace. Peace indeed. What peace could be had with another in power over the Gerudo? Compromise or not, after centuries, if not more, of tradition, it was impossible. That very king's army had been trying to kill him for years. Peace. My people desire to follow their own traditional trajectory. A Hyrulean overlord would go against their very nature. If being ruled is such a terrible thing for the Gerudo, then why do they want a king at all? She asked, her curiosity genuinely piqued. If you know the history of my people, my lady, then you know who I am. You know how many male Gerudo are born in a century. You know how much that means to them. Fury grew in his chest again. How dare she question his people? She should worry about her own, especially if she enraged him enough. I see, she replied, a certain disappointment evident in her voice. Then I am afraid we are at an impasse. I cannot provide your victuals if you refuse to even consider my request. Do travel home safely. She smiled pleasantly at him, infuriating him more. Is this what it would come down to? He'd truly have to take it by force, destroy this woman's peaceful town and perhaps even the people themselves? She didn't know what she was risking. But the longer the seconds drew by, the less he cared. His power was overcoming him, his moral compass, his conscience. They flickered like dwindling candlelight. "I highly suggest you change your mind," he told her, his body trembling with fury. There was no way she didn't see it now. A faint red mist began to emanate from him as he slowly stood. She raised an eyebrow, and the door behind him burst open. The same guards he met before stood at the entrance, gripping... Ganondorf didn't know what exactly. Weapons, seemingly, but they seemed to glow with a ghostly blue pattern. Projections, not steel. If he reached out and touched it, he didn't know if he'd feel anything, or if his fingers would be severed. The technology of which people spoke belonging to the Sheikah, he must be witnessing its power this very instant. The uncertainty of it settled him, dissipated the mist. He did not know how powerful these weapons were, did not know if his own power could destroy them or even make a mark. And he did not want to risk it to find out. "Prince Ganondorf," Lady Impa said, still kneeling on her cushion, unfazed. He turned back to her, seething. "I highly suggest you change your mind." The guards began to crowd him out of the building, their glowing blue weapons humming through the air. Whether it was magic or otherwise, he did not know, and he felt real fear for the first time in a long time. They successfully pushed him out and down the stairwell, and his people stared at him, shuffling in unease. It was demoralizing, being herded by these men he didn't know in full view of the people who followed him. They stopped before the group of Gerudo, and one of the men spoke again. "Leave Kakariko, and do not return." Ganondorf narrowed his eyes in response. They dropped his own weapons at his feet. "Unless you decide to heed Lady Impa's demands." It took everything in him not to rip these men apart, but he retrieved his weapons, stiffened his body, and turned, raising a fist to signal to his people that they were leaving. He heard them murmuring behind him as he walked forward, a leader, a named king. Adira's taunting echoed in his mind. He resisted the urge to gaze down at his hands to see them shaking. A king's hands should never shake. They made camp just outside of the village. Ganondorf's mind reeled as he tried to strategize to determine how he could overcome the insufferable demands of Lady Impa, a woman who so obviously did not respect other cultures. She had teased him with an offer of help while assuming he would bend the knee to the usurper. She would regret that. Jerusa arrived unbidden to his mind as he sat by a fire in the dead of night. Sleep would not come, not until he knew what to do. He wondered what she would advise. Over the years, Jerusa had grown in intelligence, proving her worth to the elders who took her on as an apprentice of sorts. She seemed perfect to him, the best fighter, the smartest student, the most beautiful Gerudo. Their friendship had shifted into something else, and there was nothing he could do to brace against it. Had this not been the case, he would have taken her on as an advisor once he was crowned. But now there was too much uncertainty. He pondered that she might tell him to leave, just take the loss and figure out another solution. Don't let his anger take over. But how was he to allow other people in power the leniency to make demands? How was he to be merciful when he was supposed to be the most powerful and dangerous man in the world? He could not avoid his destiny, and war was part of that destiny. The stars twinkled above him, bright and numerous. The moon was hidden tonight, allowing the darkness to contrast against the light they emitted. He'd always found the moon intriguing. It had power itself, pulling on the oceans, deciding when and if one could see every star, and there was nothing anyone could do to change it or stop it from doing its duty. He would have to be as powerful as the moon, and one day he would be. Perhaps this decision he had to make would determine whether he was up to the challenge. The grass to his right crunched, and he looked up from his rumination to see a figure standing there, lit by the firelight. Not a Gerudo. His people were sleeping away the night a few yards away. A Sheikah. Ganondorf stood and drew his club from his back. The Sheikah man's eyes were wide, but not in fear. He seemed odd. "Who are you?" Ganondorf asked, his voice gruff and tired. He was done with these people. Would he have to kill this man to let them know? My name is Dormo," the man said. His voice shook with an emotion Ganondorf couldn't quite place. Excitement? Ganondorf took 2 steps toward him and the man cowered a bit. "And what is it you want?" He kept moving forward, forcing the man to step back until he was flat against the hillside behind him. Then the man did an unexpected thing. He knelt. Head bowed, hands to the ground, a full submission. Ganondorf frowned, wondering if this was some kind of trap, a ruse to get him to feel at ease. "Your Majesty," the man said into the dirt, "I am here to serve you." A Sheikah man serving the Gerudo King? The preposterousness of the idea almost made Ganondorf laugh. Something wasn't right here. He would figure out what it was, however he had to. "Rise." He wanted to gain this man's full trust first. He did as instructed and gazed into Ganondorf's eyes with the same strange admiration. It seemed genuine, but he wasn't certain he could trust it. "You're Sheikah. Why would you serve me? Considering your lady's opinion of me, I'd think you'd want nothing to do with my rule." "My king, you have supporters in places other than your own home. It may surprise you to know it, but it's true." "Explain." "I am part of a secret faction of Sheikah who support your claim to the throne. Your Grace, we've heard tell of your awe-inspiring red power." The man opened the front of his white robe to reveal a hidden, blood-red sash wrapped diagonally across his torso. "We believe you have the rightful claim and the ability to lead. Rauru is an unfit leader, a man unwilling to do what is necessary. He is an imposter from the sky, and his race is dwindling." Dwindling? Ganondorf thought of the mysterious Zonai and their unexpected appearance in this land years ago. The people then thought them gods. Some still did, but according to Ganondorf's studies, Rauru was just another vulnerable being who could be killed, just like any other mortal. But again, how could he trust a Sheikah? There was only one way to find out, if the foolish man still pledged loyalty afterward. Ganondorf knew he could take his word for truth. Without a second thought, he raised a hand and aimed his power at the man. It slammed into him, wrapping itself around a leg. The Sheikah screamed. A familiar sound. A welcome sound. Ganondorf stepped towards him, letting the red tendrils squeeze and devour. But not completely. He'd be injured for certain, but not dead. Not yet. He strode right up to the Sheikah's contorted face. "This is that power you are so fond of. What do you think?" He said nothing, but his screams died down, and he stared wide-eyed, his pupils contracting with a stubborn determination. "Nothing to say? Admit your lies now, or there will be consequences." He remained silent, grunting in pain, but withstanding the agony fairly well, considering. Finally, Ganondorf felt satisfied. He withdrew the power and let the man fall to the ground in a heap. His trousers were half eaten away, and the skin underneath chewed into a pulpy wound that Ganondorf was unsure would heal. He'd never allowed anyone to live after using his power on them, after all. He knelt down to the man's level. "Do you still serve me?" The man hesitated only for a moment. "You are my king,"